Hi.
Hey.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So hopefully Corinne doesn't need too much introduction, but for those of you who need a little bit of background on her, I can't believe it was over 10 years ago that her huge song, Put Your Records On, came out and was sort of omnipresent on the radio. I remember it well. Since then, she's won a couple of Grammy Awards, among other things, and her latest album last year, The Heart Speaks in Whispers, which Corinne also had a wonderful podcast of the same name that I feel the need to tell everyone about. It's fantastic. You should look it up. Was among the best albums of last year, and the song Green Aphrodisiac was actually on President Barack Obama's summer playlist, which is a unique honor. Do you remember hearing about that? How did you find out?
I was really excited about it. He had two playlists. He had a daytime playlist and a nighttime playlist. And the song was on the nighttime playlist, which I thought was interesting. You know, just imagining those guys just having a little slow dance to
a little mood-setting music.
Yeah,
for Barack and Michelle. Nice. Well, we're here to talk about a few different important causes that you're involved in, and just dialing back a little bit, I get the sense that you really grew up in an atmosphere where being politically and socially aware was instilled in you as something that was important. Why don't you take us back to that a little bit first?
I grew up in a sort of activist environment. My mum is a teacher and an educator. Well, both my parents are actually. My dad worked with children who've been excluded from school, which in our particular area of Leeds was a lot of black and Asian children. And he's really passionate about alternative education outside the mainstream of schools, and very aware of how sometimes schools can bring their own prejudice and their own assumptions about children, which can be damaging and can lead to, you know, them feeling excluded and then ultimately sort of leading to bad behaviour that causes them to be excluded. So he teaches kind of outside of the mainstream, but my mum teaches in schools, and she was very sort of active when I was growing up. She would always give us an alternative perspective on television and radio and the news. I remember doing a science project at school, and I think the question was along the lines of, you know, why is Africa so poor, or why is Africa so famine-stricken? It was one of these sort of vague, ill-informed questions that I remember learning from my mum for the first time about colonialism and about African countries developing cash crops for the West and not being encouraged to grow tobacco and sugar and all these goods for export, and how that had impoverished soil in particular countries. And so I went back into my science lesson with this kind of political, geopolitical angle to their question, you know, and sort of 10 years old with my sheaf of notes. But I was really excited to have this kind of alternative information, this kind of counter narrative to what we're receiving. And then the 80s and 90s in the UK were a really political time, and people were very much engaged with fighting apartheid in South Africa. We had a prime minister who kind of ignored a lot of the issues around apartheid and wasn't very responsive to Nelson Mandela or the ANC. So Leeds, being a very multicultural city, was kind of a site of protest and marches and boycotting South African goods. And I remember that was a big part of our childhood as well. So I feel like I got these influences, you know, from both my parents, and also growing up in this this kind of Baptist church that was it was very much sort of socially engaged. You know, people were working in Bangladesh with people with leprosy, and going to Romania to work with orphans, and speaking in prisons, and that was a big part of the sort of message of, you know, Christianity that I was brought up with, is that it's a sort of socially engaged, radical, alternative movement. So yeah, it was kind of all around me when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think of your music as being necessarily overtly political, but I do think of it as music that has a sense of a message behind it. When you started becoming prominent as an artist, did you immediately feel like there's no way my worldview and my art can be separated? Was it very natural for them to come together in what you were writing?
Yeah, for me, I've always been a big believer in that sort of feminist maxim of the personal is the political. So, if you can write songs about sort of marching in the streets, which I have written songs about that, but I also think writing about, the way that we think of ourselves and self-care and self-love and being proud of our diversity and our individuality. I think those are political acts, and I think writing music that just is a counter-narrative to everyone should look hot and sexy all the time and be having a great night out on a Saturday and just being hedonistic and selfish as a kind of main message that we're getting a lot of the time through sort of fun pop music, which I actually really enjoy. But I like to have a different message to that, and I think that is a political act. I think every time that you express yourself as an individual and kind of ignore the powerful stories that we're being told, which homogenizes, I think every time you do that, it's a political act. So I'm happy to sort of be myself in music, and I think that is just radical in and of itself.
Well, I was going to say that I think that when you first came out, it did feel very radical that you presented yourself in this very natural, this is just me way, and now that feels much more like it's becoming the norm with female artists in the pop sphere. And do you feel like attitudes towards the way women present themselves in music have changed a lot since you first came out?
Yeah, definitely, although I think there's still a really big focus on women and how women sort of use their bodies and their sexuality. I think there's still a really big focus on that, and I think if you're an artist that chooses to not present yourself in like a sort of hypersexual way, it can go the other way and you're sort of infantilized and people think of you as this sort of girl child. And I remember someone once coming up to me in an airport and saying, I bet you've never thought a bad thing in your whole life. Which I thought, just sort of stick around for half an hour. But it's just part of that thing of people think, well, I've never seen your breasts or ass cheeks, therefore you must be a particular type of person. And, I love my breasts and ass cheeks. And but I don't feel like that's part of like the thing that I am selling in the world or doing. So I don't know, that's the thing.
Well, and one wonderful way in which you've sort of engaged with this recently is with the designer Sophie Thiele on this World Citizens campaign that has been great, presenting a really diverse array of women. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, I really love the World Citizen campaign and anything really that puts a wide variety of images of how we all look in the world. I think that it's really important for all of us to kind of see ourselves celebrated, to be able to look at different body types and different parameters in gender and different ethnicities. And I think that's really important for us to see. And I thought the World Citizen campaign, I was really pleased to be a small part of it. And, for me, it only involved being photographed in a really beautiful dress, which was very easy.
I was going to say, you look pretty glam, too.
Thanks. Yeah, she's a really great designer, but, she has always put, especially, she's a French designer and she works in New York, and she's always shown black models. It's always been sort of part of her thing, and she's been going, sort of 10, 15 years, and there's no sort of novelty for her in like, ooh, let's do an all-black catwalk. The idea that certain ethnicities kind of go in and out of fashion, which is, definitely a thing that happens in marketing. I've always respected Sophie for the fact that she thinks it's important to use, models of color and models who are different shapes and sizes and different ages and have quite sometimes her models have unusual features, really strong Roman noses or uneven teeth, or just these tiny things that are actually tiny radical acts in fashion, where there's definitely an emphasis on the symmetrical, on the able-bodied, on perfecting any imperfection that we see, anything that doesn't fit in. So I was really glad to be part of that campaign, and I think anything that just shows the humans around and celebrates the humans, it makes you feel so good. It makes you feel valid and relevant and normal, and I think that's important.
And I like the idea of tiny radical acts. That's the way that change happens for sure. So on the flip side of some interesting things you've been involved in lately, you, I know, are very involved in, bringing water to places that need it. And this is something that I think is a great example of you found something locally that ended up having a global impact. So you work with this organization called Pump Aid. Tell us a bit about how you discovered them in the first place.
I discovered Pump Aid because I think in the first ever interview I did, I had mentioned something about swimming pools, or like how I could never imagine having a swimming pool. At that time I was like, it's such a waste of water. Like, I was very right on, Now I'm like, a swimming pool, but at that time I was like, I can't imagine ever having a swimming pool because it's such a waste of water. And I remember having this big conversation about, there's 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to clean water, and sort of what are we doing? Like, how have we not got that part right, where we're really like, we want every child to have a laptop, but there's still 1 billion people who, when they wake up in the morning, there's no clean water, and that was a really sort of big issue for me. And there was there's a small company in the city where I work who had done a partnership with this organisation called Pump Aid, and I found out about it, and to me it was a different kind of charity. I'm used to dealing with a lot of charities that are maybe set up in Europe, and it's Europeans going to Africa, seeing what's wrong with Africa, and using their sort of know-how to kind of swoop in and help Africans. And, I think it's really worthy and important. But this charity was different because it was started in Zimbabwe, and it was started by Zimbabwean teachers. They were teaching in their class, and very often kids are kind of absent from school, either because they're collecting water all day, or they're ill because the water contains diseases. It gets really easily infected, so quite often they're off school with diarrhea and dysentery. But this time there was a little girl who missed school for a few days, and they were quite concerned. They got in touch with her family, and it turned out that this little girl had drank some water, but the water, a poisonous snake had fallen into this well and poisoned the well, and the child had died. And she was a really important part of the school, and the teachers just put their heads together and were thinking, what can we do? How can we change this situation? We're intelligent people, we teach science, how can we work this out? And they designed this really amazing pump, and it works on kind of that old Archimedes principle, where you have a crank and a wheel and a sort of string of bamboo with lots of different cups on, and it goes right down into the well, scoops up the water, and then kind of forces these cups of water up through a plastic tube, and the water comes out clean because you've gone deep enough down to get away from all the contaminants, and you haven't used your hands on it as well, so you haven't put any more sort of bacteria into the water. So they invented this thing, and it can be made with just scraps that are found locally, rubber that's available. You can make the wheel out of just scrap metal, and I've seen sort of 15-year-old boys kind of make this thing. So it's an amazing pump, and they've provided more than 1 million people with clean water in Zimbabwe, and then moved to Malawi and then doing the same thing. So I was really lucky to go out in 2007 and see the work they were doing. And it's really incredible just to see the kind of knock-on effects, So you think of water as being a really simple issue. People need water or they'll die. But water also has this knock-on effect where if you don't have clean water, you have to boil the water to make it clean. So you have to chop down the trees to make the firewood. So if you don't have clean water, it leads to deforestation. If you're a girl and your family needs water, you have to miss half a day of school walking miles to get it and miles back. So water ends up being this sort of feminist issue where, girls are in school if they can get access to clean water. Also, a lot of the water problems in sub-Saharan Africa are due to the fact that there's conflict in particular zones. So sometimes you've got these young girls and women walking outside the village into areas that are run by soldiers, and there's a lot of opportunities for them to be taken advantage of and abused, and they're not safe. So there's all these reasons why it's important for these areas to have clean water. And as I saw what was happening, I was really impressed with it. They have pumps at the schools so that the kids, instead of being at home farming and helping their families, they can come to school, do some farming at lunchtime, take home crops that they've grown, and be really proud and be contributing to the economics of their family. So it was amazing to be there and see what they were doing, and I'm involved with them in lots of sort of ongoing campaigns and speaking about them, and I just feel like this is something that we have to get right in the world. It's such a basic one.
I was going to say it's a very low-tech solution to a huge problem, and it seems like the change it can make is pretty huge, just for something that's so simple to put together.
PumpAid's a small organisation, but it does a lot of research for bigger charities like Oxfam and the Red Cross. So it's been able to help these organisations work on this kind of local, like you say, kind of low-tech, non-sexy kind of way, but in a way that's really transforming people's lives and allowing village elders to decide if they want the pumps, where they want the pumps. It's not a situation that sort of swoops in and takes over, and that's why I really like it.
Mm-hmm. I feel like for artists, there's always this double-edged sword of when you're an activist and an artist, whether you should just be, there are people who think you should just be performing and the whole sort of shut up and sing attitude. But now in this particular moment, it really feels like artists are being called upon to do something in the world and, to put their actions where their, words have been. Do you feel like attitudes have changed in terms of, what you feel like the larger community expects of you as an artist and what you're doing in the world?
I think attitudes have changed just in terms of what we all expect of each other. I think people are becoming more and more engaged and realizing that although we get this message that the world is controlled by these powerful organizations and sometimes there's so little we can do, and they all get together and fund political campaigns, and we have all this information but we're so powerless. I think we get that message, but we also know that the world is just run by people, and people can have a change of heart in a moment. People can learn things they didn't learn. They can have conversations with people and suddenly have a radical new perspective. So to me, that really gives me hope that things aren't sort of entrenched and locked in these unchangeable power structures, but that change is possible, that it's necessary, that historically it's always happened, that our world is in flux, and I think I'm sure we all feel like we can do things, we can do more, we can be more well informed, we can have more conversations, and I think this is an interesting time because of the way that technology can link us up. You can be part of a very small group that can have a really big influence.
Mm-hmm.
So
Completely.
I think it's not just artists, it's every person.
Completely. Well, I know you're performing at Jazz Fest later today, right?
That's
so
right.
if people are around, they should go catch her. Thank you so much. I think this is great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.